Hey guys, tonight we step into a year when the world did not explode. It simply began to disappear. You drift back to 1177 BC, not to a battlefield, not to a single empire, but to an entire world system. At first, everything looks stable. Ships move across calm Mediterranean waters. Caravans cross dusty roads. Scribes bend over clay tablets. Kings exchange letters sealed with clay and authority. If you didn't know better, you would think this was the peak of civilization. And in many ways it was. You were standing in the late Bronze Age, a time when Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Babylon, Assyria, and the Canaanite city-states were connected in ways surprisingly modern. It was a globalized world. Yes, globalized. Copper from Cyprus, tin from faraway lands, luxury goods from Anatolia, grain from Egypt, diplomatic marriages across borders. You might imagine ancient people as isolated and primitive. But here, in 1177 BC, they are interconnected. Their economies depend on each other. Their armies rely on bronze, a metal that requires trade between distant regions. Their political stability rests on fragile alliances. And yet, you would never guess that within a few decades, nearly every one of these great powers would fall. Not slowly, not over centuries, but within a shockingly short span of time. Historians still argue whether it was invasion, climate change, internal revolt, economic fragility, or something far more complex. But tonight, you don't rush to conclusions. You simply observe. You walk through a prosperous port city. Markets hum softly. Merchants measure goods carefully. A donkey pulls a cart loaded with amphory. Children run between stone columns. The sky is clear. No omen appears. No prophecy is carved into the walls. And yet, the worst is still to come. There is something oddly modern about this moment. If you squint, the late Bronze Age almost feels like a prototype of our own interconnected world. One supply chain fails, and everything trembles. One political alliance breaks, and tensions ripple outward. But the people of 1177 BC do not know that they stand at the edge of systemic collapse. They believe their world is permanent. Egypt has stood for centuries. The Hittites dominate Anatolia. Mycenaean palaces manage complex bureaucracies. Writing systems record taxes, treaties, and trade agreements. In fact, one well-known historical fact gives us a chilling anchor. Inscriptions from Pharaoh Ramesses III later describe massive invasions by mysterious groups he called the Sea Peoples. He claims to have repelled them. He even carved the story into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Triumph carved in stone. But stone can lie, or at least it can simplify, because even Egypt, which survived longer than most, would soon weaken dramatically. You begin to sense something, a fragility. These kingdoms are powerful, but they're also deeply dependent. They rely on steady harvests, on secure trade routes, on stable succession of rulers, on predictable climate patterns, on bronze, always bronze. Without tin and copper flowing steadily, weapons cannot be forged. Tools cannot be replaced. Armies cannot maintain dominance. Is an entire system balanced delicately, like a palace built on perfectly stacked stones. Remove one, just one, and the structure shifts. Remove several, and the world tilts. There's an eccentric curiosity from this era that feels almost symbolic. In one surviving letter from a Near Eastern king, he complains to another ruler about delayed shipments of luxury goods. Not famine, not invasion, but missing gifts. Even in a world on the brink, diplomacy still revolved around prestige items. Gold cups, ivory carvings, exotic fabrics. It feels strangely human and strangely normal. Normality is often the most deceptive moment in history, because collapse rarely announces itself politely. It creeps, quietly, almost invisibly. Historians still debate whether the collapse was a single catastrophic event or a cascade of overlapping crises. Some argue for coordinated invasions. Others point to prolonged drought. Some suggest systems collapse, a theory that complex societies become so interconnected that they become fragile. When stress increases beyond resilience, they snap. You look around again. The markets continue. The temples stand tall. Ships glide across sunlit water. But imagine just for a moment that trade stops. Imagine roads becoming unsafe. Imagine harvests shrinking. Imagine local rebellions igniting in provinces far from the capital. Now, imagine all of that happening at once. That is what makes 1177 BC so haunting. Not just that one civilization fell, but that many did, within a surprisingly short period. Ugarit burned. The Hittite capital Hattusa was abandoned. Mycenaean palaces collapsed. Cities across the Levant showed destruction layers. Writing systems vanish in some regions. Administrative complexity disappears. Populations shrink. And then, silence. Centuries of silence in some areas. The so-called Greek Dark Age follows. Less writing, less monumental architecture, less visible complexity. It is not the end of humanity, but it is the end of a world. And you're standing right before the curtain falls. You do not yet see flames. You do not yet hear panic. You simply feel stillness. A fragile stillness. The kind that comes before a storm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to imagine all of us drifting through history together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because in the next section, you will see just how connected this ancient world truly was, and how dangerous that connection could become. You begin to see the web, not a spider's web, not something delicate and small, but a vast, invisible network stretching from the Nile Delta to the mountains of Anatolia, from the shores of Mycenaean Greece to the cities of Mesopotamia. In 1177 BC, this world is not isolated. Is synchronized. You stand above the eastern Mediterranean and imagine invisible lines connecting kingdoms. Ships move in steady rhythms. Caravans follow established roads. Copper leaves Cyprus. Tin arrives from distant lands, possibly Central Asia, perhaps Anatolia, perhaps even farther. Bronze emerges. Without bronze, there is no army. Without bronze, there are no plows. Without bronze, there is no dominance. One well-known historical fact grounds this interconnectedness, the Ulubran shipwreck. Discovered off the coast of modern Turkey, this 14th century BC cargo vessel carried copper ingots, tin, glass beads, ivory, ebony, and luxury goods from multiple regions. It is like a floating catalog of globalization. You imagine it intact, heavy with wealth, gliding across calm water. And it was not alone. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of ships must have crossed these routes regularly. Egypt depends on foreign timber for shipbuilding. The Hittites depend on trade for precious materials. Mycenaean elites crave exotic goods to reinforce their prestige. Babylonian rulers exchange gifts to maintain diplomatic balance. It is a dance of mutual reliance, and you sense the elegance of it. You also sense the danger, because when systems depend on each other, they become efficient, but they also become fragile. Historians still argue whether this level of complexity made the late Bronze Age more vulnerable than earlier, simpler societies. Complexity brings wealth, but complexity also brings risk. You walk through a Canaanite port city. Warehouse after warehouse lines the harbor. Clay tablets record shipments. A scribe carefully inscribes quantities of grain and oil. His handwriting is precise. He believes the system will continue. Why wouldn't he? For generations, it has. A minor eccentric curiosity survives in some tablets from this era. Detailed complaints about late shipments and missing cargo. Even in a thriving world, people grumbled about logistics. There is something comfortingly human about that. You can almost hear the sigh of a merchant waiting for tin that has not arrived. Perhaps the caravan was delayed. Perhaps a storm slowed the ships. Perhaps a political dispute closed a border temporarily. Small disruptions are normal. Small disruptions are manageable. But what happens when disruptions are no longer small? You imagine a drought reducing harvests in one region. That region exports less grain. Another region, dependent on imported grain, begins to feel pressure. Food prices rise. Political tension increases. A ruler demands tribute more aggressively. A neighboring state responds defensively. Trade slows further. A single tremor becomes a vibration. A vibration becomes instability. And instability spreads. This is not a dramatic invasion. Not yet. It is a tightening. A slow constriction. You stand in a Mycenaean palace, perhaps in Pylos or Mycenae. The architecture is impressive. Administrative rooms are filled with clay tablets written in linear B. These tablets record rations, livestock, labor allocations. The bureaucracy is sophisticated, but it depends on central coordination. If the palace burns, the system collapses. There is no decentralized backup. There is no redundancy. The entire structure rests on a few administrative centers. You notice something unsettling. Many late Bronze Age systems were centralized. Palaces controlled distribution. Kings controlled diplomacy. Storage facilities held surplus goods. It worked beautifully, as long as nothing went wrong. Historians still debate whether this centralization made collapse more likely. Some scholars argue that highly centralized societies lack flexibility. When shock comes, adaptation is slow. You walk again to the coast. Ships glide peacefully. You imagine what might happen if maritime routes became unsafe. Piracy, migration, blockade. Suddenly, copper shipments slow. Tin becomes scarce. Bronze production declines. Weapons become harder to replace. Military readiness weakens. Rivals sense opportunity. And in this world, opportunity often means expansion. The late Bronze Age powers were not gentle neighbors. They competed. They negotiated. They married across borders. They threatened. They flattered. Diplomatic letters between kings addressed each other as brother. But brother sometimes meant temporary ally. It is a delicate balance, like a row of standing stones. Push one, and several may fall. You look across the Mediterranean one more time. It is beautiful. Blue water, green hills, golden fields, the very image of stability. But stability in a complex system is not the same as resilience. Resilience requires flexibility, buffer, redundancy. We do not know how much buffer these societies truly had. And that uncertainty is haunting, because within a few decades of 1177 BC, many of these interconnected hubs would fall, not gradually fading into obscurity, but showing layers of destruction, burn layers, abandonment, population reduction, and then silence in the records. Writing disappears in some regions for centuries. Trade networks fragment. Localized cultures replace imperial systems. The web dissolves. You feel the tension now, not fear, but fragility. A network so advanced that it may have outpaced its own ability to absorb shock. And you're only beginning to see how tightly it was woven. In the next section, you will lean closer to the human side of this network. You will listen to kings addressing each other as equals. You will read letters that sound almost modern, and you may notice something subtle hiding between the lines. You lean closer now, not to a battlefield, not to a burning city, but to a table made of wood and authority. Upon it rests a clay tablet, freshly pressed, still slightly damp. A scribe bends carefully over its surface, stylus in hand, carving wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. You watch as he writes a message from one king to another. Not an order, not a threat, but a greeting. Say to my brother. That is how many of these letters begin. One well-known historical fact anchors you here: the Amarna letters. Discovered in Egypt, These clay tablets preserve diplomatic correspondence between the pharaoh and other great kings of the late Bronze Age. Hittite rulers, Babylonian kings, Canaanite governors. They address each other as equals, as brothers. It sounds warm, but diplomacy is rarely sentimental. You sit beside the scribe as he finishes the tablet. He records gifts exchanged between kingdoms. Gold, horses, fine garments. He records complaints about delayed shipments. He records requests for military support. He records subtle frustrations hidden beneath formal language. And you begin to notice something. These letters reveal not only cooperation, but strain. Historians still argue whether these diplomatic records show early signs of instability or simply the normal tensions of international politics. But you sense fragility in the tone. A Babylonian king once complained that the gold sent by Egypt was not as pure as promised. Another ruler asked repeatedly for more military assistance. Some letters carry urgency. One Canaanite city governor wrote desperate pleas for protection, warning that enemies were approaching. He begged for archers. He begged for help. He waited. You imagine the delay. A messenger traveling for weeks across desert and sea. A response written. Another journey back. In a stable world, delay is inconvenient. In a fragile world, delay is catastrophic. You step into a royal hall. Tall columns support a painted ceiling. Officials stand in calm formation. A messenger kneels. He presents a sealed clay tablet. The king breaks the seal slowly. He reads. His face remains composed, but you wonder what calculations are forming behind his steady expression. These rulers were not merely warriors. They were managers of complex systems. They balanced alliances carefully. Marriage diplomacy was common. Royal daughters were sent across borders to strengthen bonds. Foreign queens lived in distant courts. It was a web of relationships woven through family and politics. But webs can tangle, and sometimes they can tear. There's an eccentric curiosity in one surviving letter. A ruler apologizes for not sending a proper gift because of circumstances. The wording is vague. Historians debate what those circumstances were. Political unrest? Economic strain? Logistical failure? Or something else entirely? You notice how careful the language is. No king openly declares weakness. They mask instability behind formal phrases. Even when asking for help, they frame it diplomatically. Pride remains intact. Appearances must be maintained. But beneath ceremony, stress can accumulate. You imagine how news traveled in this world. Slowly, by foot, by ship, by caravan. If one city fell, others might not know for weeks. If harvests failed in one region, neighboring kingdoms might not immediately understand the scale. Information moved, but not instantly. And that delay could magnify crisis. You walk through scribal school. Young trainees practice writing on small clay tablets. They memorize formulas. They learn diplomatic phrasing. They copy earlier treaties. Writing is power. Writing preserves agreements. Writing stabilizes relationships. But writing also freezes reality in time. If reality shifts quickly, tablets cannot adapt fast enough. Historians still debate whether the late Bronze Age collapse involved sudden shocks or gradual pressures building over decades. Some argue for invasions as the primary cause. Others suggest economic breakdown. Still others point to climate stress. But when you read these letters, you sense a system under tension. A polite system. A formal system. A system trying to hold itself together. You picture multiple kings receiving troubling news at roughly the same time. Delayed shipments. Unrest in border territories. Strange movements of peoples near coastlines. Perhaps even reports of ships appearing unexpectedly. Imagine sitting in a palace and hearing whispers of instability from multiple directions. You would not panic. Not immediately. You would write letters. You would request confirmation. You would dispatch envoys. You would attempt to reinforce alliances. Diplomacy is the first response to uncertainty. But diplomacy requires time, and time may have been the one resource this world did not have enough of. You pause in silence. Clay tablets surround you. Hundreds, thousands, administrative memory stored in hardened earth. And then you remember something unsettling. In many regions after 1177 BC, writing disappears. Entire administrative systems vanish. Linear B in Greece disappears. Records cease in some Canaanite cities. The bureaucratic heartbeat of the Bronze Age goes quiet. It is not dramatic. It is not theatrical. It is simply absence. The silence of scribes no longer writing. You hold one final tablet in your hand. Its message formal, measured, hopeful. May there be peace between us. The king seals it. The messenger departs. The system continues, for now. But somewhere beyond the horizon, forces are gathering. Not necessarily coordinated, not necessarily intentional, but converging. And the web of brothers and alliances will soon be tested. In the next section, you will walk along the coastline. You will see ships approaching. You will hear a name carved into Egyptian stone. The Sea Peoples. And whether they were invaders, migrants, or something far more complex, their arrival would echo across this fragile world. You walk toward the shoreline. The air feels different now. Not darker, not stormy, just uncertain. The sea stretches endlessly before you, calm and luminous beneath a wide Bronze Age sky. Fishing boats drift gently. Trade vessels sit anchored near the harbor. Nets dry in the sunlight. Nothing appears unusual. And yet, carved into Egyptian stone, there's a warning. A name, or rather, a label. The Sea Peoples. One well-known historical fact grounds this moment firmly in history. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Pharaoh Ramesses III. On its walls, detailed carvings depict foreign groups arriving by land and sea. Ships with distinctive prows, warriors with feathered headdresses, families traveling in ox-drawn carts. The inscriptions claim that Egypt defeated them, that they came in waves, that they sought new lands, that they were stopped. But stone inscriptions are royal propaganda. They tell the story the pharaoh once remembered. Historians still argue whether the Sea Peoples were organized invaders, displaced refugees, opportunistic raiders, or a loose coalition of migrating groups responding to deeper instability. You imagine standing on the shore in 1177 BC. At first, you see small silhouettes on the horizon. Ships, not the familiar trading vessels. Something different. Their shapes unfamiliar. Their formation uncertain. Word spreads quietly through the port. Messengers run to local officials. Merchants pause mid-transaction. Children are pulled closer to home. Still no panic, because trade ships also come from faraway lands. Foreign vessels are not automatically threats, but as more ships appear, as unfamiliar banners flutter, as coastal villages further north report disturbances, concern grows. You picture the Eastern Mediterranean as a long chain of connected settlements. If one coastal city is attacked, others may soon hear whispers. Perhaps at first it is dismissed. A local conflict, piracy, a misunderstanding. But then another city reports destruction, and another, and another. Some archaeological layers across the Levant and Anatolia show signs of burning around this period. Ugarit, a thriving port city, appears to have been destroyed rapidly. Tablets found there include unfinished letters, suggesting the city fell quickly, perhaps unexpectedly. One such tablet contains a desperate plea for help, written shortly before destruction. The king of Ugarit asked for assistance, but help may never have arrived. You imagine the final days. Harbor quiet, smoke rising in the distance. Ships not arriving, or arriving with hostile intent. The Sea Peoples, as depicted in Egyptian art, do not appear merely as raiders. Some scenes show women and children traveling with them. Ox carts, possessions, entire communities on the move. This complicates the narrative. Were they invaders? or migrants fleeing crises elsewhere. Historians still debate whether these groups originated from the Aegean, Anatolia, the Balkans, or elsewhere. The evidence is fragmented. Pottery styles shift. Weapon types change. Names appear in Egyptian inscriptions, but are difficult to match conclusively with known cultures. You stand again by the sea. Ships draw closer. You cannot see faces clearly, but you sense movement, determination, perhaps desperation. If climate shifts disrupted harvests in certain regions, if political instability weakened local authorities, if trade networks began to falter, then migration might not be aggression. It might be survival. But when large groups move suddenly into already stressed systems, friction becomes inevitable. Imagine a coastal city dependent on regular grain shipments. Now imagine additional mouths to feed arriving unexpectedly. Or imagine military forces stretched thin, protecting multiple trade routes simultaneously. A system already under strain does not need a massive invasion. It only needs one more variable. Some scholars propose that the sea peoples were not the sole cause of collapse, but rather a symptom of broader, systemic instability. Others argue they were a primary driver, overwhelming weakened states. There is no unanimous conclusion, and that uncertainty lingers like mist over water. You look at the Egyptian reliefs again in your mind. Ramesses III claims victory. He claims Egypt repelled the sea peoples both by land and sea. Chariots charge. Archers fire. Enemy ships capsize. It is dramatic. But Egypt survived longer than most. Many northern kingdoms did not. The Hittite Empire collapses. Its capital, Hattusa, is abandoned. Mycenaean palace centers show destruction. Canaanite cities burn. Trade routes fracture. Was it coordinated attack, chain reaction, or simultaneous stress from multiple pressures? Perhaps the sea peoples were one spark among many. Perhaps they were the visible face of invisible problems. You imagine a fragile web being shaken from multiple directions. Drought in one region, earthquakes in another, political tension in a third. Migration flows increasing, trade slowing, fear spreading quietly. Then ships appear, and fear becomes action. But even here, in the midst of approaching vessels, there is still calm in your narration. No screaming, no chaos, just the slow awareness that something is changing. The shoreline, once predictable, becomes uncertain, and uncertainty erodes stability. You stand still. The ships are closer now, oars dipping rhythmically into water, wind filling sails. On deck, small figures move deliberately. You do not know their names. You do not know their origins. You only know that their arrival coincides with a period of unprecedented collapse. Whether they caused it, accelerated it, or were swept up in it, they are part of the story, and the Mediterranean world will never be the same again. In the next section, you will step into cities that did not survive. You will walk through streets that were not rebuilt, and you will see how multiple civilizations seem to fall within a surprisingly narrow window of time. You step into a city that no longer exists, not in the way it once did. Its stones remain, its foundations endure, but its voice is gone. You walk through the streets of Ugarit, or perhaps Hattusa, or Mycenae. It hardly matters which one first, because what is most unsettling is not that one city burned. It is that many did, within a surprisingly narrow window of time. Archaeology tells us this plainly. In city after city across the eastern Mediterranean, destruction layers appear dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Char beams, collapsed walls, pottery shattered in place, abandoned storage rooms. One well-known historical fact anchors this pattern. The capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattusa, was abandoned and never reoccupied at the same scale after its destruction around this period. An imperial center, simply gone. You walk its wide stone gates, once guarded, once impressive, now silent. The Hittite Empire had been one of the great powers of its time. It negotiated directly with Egypt, It commanded armies. It controlled trade routes. And then, its administrative structure disappears. Historians still debate whether Hattusa fell due to invasion, internal revolt, famine, or a combination of pressures. But the result is undeniable. The imperial system fractures. You travel west, to the Mycenaean world. Palaces like Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns show destruction layers around this era. Linear B tablets, administrative records, were found baked hard by the fires that destroyed their storage rooms. A strange irony. The fire that ended the system preserved its last bureaucratic breath. You imagine the palace at Pylos. Officials moving calmly at first, perhaps hearing rumors of unrest, perhaps reinforcing defenses, perhaps unaware of how close instability has come. Then fire, not described in epic poetry, not sung by wandering bards, just evidence in ash and clay. You step further south, to the Levant. Cities like Ugarit, once vibrant trade hubs, fall rapidly. Tablets discovered there include letters still waiting to be sent. One tablet mentions enemy ships near the coast. The message never completed its journey. Imagine writing a plea for assistance, sealing it, handing it to a messenger, and never knowing whether help would come. You pause, because this is not a slow decline. It is abrupt. Layers of burning suggest sudden events. And what makes it more haunting is the simultaneity. Historians still argue whether these destructions were coordinated invasions or overlapping crises that simply converged. Was there a single orchestrated assault sweeping across the Mediterranean? Or were weakened cities falling independently, one by one, due to accumulated strain? Perhaps both. You imagine the Bronze Age world as a row of oil lamps burning brightly. If one lamp is extinguished, others continue. But if wind sweeps through the entire corridor, multiple flames flicker at once. You stand in a market street, stalls overturned, clay jars cracked, walls blackened. But there are no skeletons described in dramatic detail. No cinematic chaos. Only aftermath. Because archaeology often reveals destruction not through spectacle, but through layers. And those layers are consistent across regions. In Anatolia, in the Levant, in Greece, not every site burned, not every settlement vanished, but enough did, enough to fracture the system. One eccentric curiosity from this era is that some smaller settlements survived while major palatial centers collapsed. Villages sometimes endured even as capitals fell. Historians debate why. Was it because smaller communities were more adaptable, less dependent on centralized bureaucracy, less visible to invaders, or simply less interconnected? It is a subtle reminder. Complexity brings power, but simplicity sometimes brings resilience. You imagine a palace dependent on imported grain, imported metal, imported luxury goods. Now imagine trade routes faltering, harvests shrinking, military obligations stretching thin, and then external pressure arrives. A spark lands in dry timber. It does not take much. You walk through Mycenae again. Massive stone walls still stand. Cyclopean masonry. Impressive, but walls alone cannot sustain an economy. Walls cannot replace missing tin. Walls cannot restore failed harvests. Walls cannot repair diplomatic trust once broken. When a palace falls in a centralized system, its network collapses with it. Administrative control disappears. Redistribution halts. Local elites lose coordination. Regional stability fractures. And as more centers fall, survivors become isolated. You feel the quiet spreading. After destruction, rebuilding is uncertain. Some cities are reoccupied at smaller scale. Others are abandoned entirely. Writing disappears in Greece for centuries after the fall of the Mycenaean palaces. The bureaucratic voice goes silent. This is not the end of people. It is the end of a system, a highly interconnected one. And because so many nodes of that system failed within a relatively short span, the collapse feels almost synchronized. Historians still debate whether the chronology aligns perfectly across all regions. dating layers precisely, is complex. Radiocarbon analysis, pottery styles, stratigraphy, all contribute pieces to the puzzle. But even allowing for variation, the pattern remains striking. Multiple great centers decline within decades, not centuries apart, decades. You stand at twilight, smoke drifting lightly over ruined streets. Not dramatic, not apocalyptic, just absence where administration once thrived. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed in a single day, but its pillars were removed in rapid succession. And once enough pillars were gone, the structure could not stand. In the next section, you will see how trade, the very lifeblood of this interconnected world, began to fail. Because sometimes cities do not burn first. Sometimes supply chains break quietly, and everything else follows. You begin to notice something that does not burn. It does not shout. It does not arrive with ships on the horizon. It simply slows. You are standing in a harbor that once felt alive with motion. Wooden hulls creaked gently against stone docks. Sailcloths snapped in the wind. Merchants called out prices in overlapping languages. Amphorae stacked high beside warehouses waited for loading. Now the harbor still functions, but the rhythm has changed. There are fewer sails on the horizon, fewer caravans emerging from inland roads, fewer crates stacked beside the docks. And in a world like the Late Bronze Age, that matters. One well-known historical fact anchors your understanding here. Bronze itself is not a naturally occurring metal. It is an alloy. It requires copper and tin combined in precise proportions. Copper could be mined in places like Cyprus. Tin was far rarer. Its sources remain debated even today, but evidence suggests it came from distant regions, possibly Anatolia, Central Asia, or even farther west. That means every sword, every spearhead, every durable farming tool relied on long-distance exchange. Without tin, copper is soft. Without bronze, military power declines. Without bronze tools, agricultural productivity weakens. The entire system depended on movement. You walk into a warehouse near the harbor. The shelves are not empty, but they are less full than before. A scribe sits cross-legged, pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay. He records quantities. He frowns slightly. The numbers are lower. Not catastrophic, just lower. Historians still argue whether trade disruption caused the collapse or resulted from it. Did foreign attacks close sea lanes first? Or did internal instability make merchants hesitant to risk travel? The answer is unclear, but the pattern is unmistakable. In several regions, evidence suggests declining imports around the time of broader collapse. You step outside and follow a caravan route inland. Dust rises slowly under hooves, but fewer animals pass this way than in previous years. Trade caravans carried not only metal but grain, textiles, oils, timber. They carried news. They carried trust. Because trade is not just material, it is relational. When kingdoms exchanged goods, they reinforced alliances. When shipments flowed regularly, stability felt secure. But if shipments were delayed, if pirates increased, if rumors of unrest spread, confidence eroded, and confidence is invisible until it vanishes. There is an eccentric curiosity in the archaeological record that speaks quietly of strain. In some regions after the collapse, bronze artifacts show signs of repeated melting and reshaping. Old tools recycled into new ones. Weapons reforged for fragments. This suggests scarcity, not total absence, but tightening supply. Recycling is practical, it is adaptive, but it is also evidence of pressure. You enter a metalworking district. Furnaces still glow, but less brightly. Metalworkers handle ingots carefully. They measure twice before pouring molten bronze into molds. They cannot afford waste. The master craftsman instructs his apprentices to conserve material. Perhaps he does not know why shipments have slowed. Perhaps he blames weather, or distant politics, or simple bad luck. But he senses that supply is no longer predictable. In a centralized palace economy, unpredictability is dangerous. The late Bronze Age palaces were administrative hubs. They collected goods, redistributed rations, managed labor, stored surplus. They functioned like the beating heart of regional systems. If the heart receives less blood, it cannot pump effectively. You walk into a Mycenaean storage hall. Rows of clay jars line the walls. Some are full, some are half filled. A palace administrator runs his fingers along a tablet, calculating projected consumption. How long will supplies last? How many soldiers can be maintained? How many workers can be fed? His calculations assume future deliveries. But what if those deliveries do not arrive? Historians still debate whether the late Bronze Age collapse fits what modern scholars call systems collapse theory. The idea suggests that highly complex societies require increasing resource input to maintain stability. When that input falters through drought, invasion, earthquake, or trade disruption, complexity becomes a burden rather than an advantage. Administrative layers cost resources. Standing armies require maintenance. Elite lifestyles demand imports. If resource flow slows, the system tightens, then fractures. You step back toward the sea. The water remains calm, but the horizon feels emptier. Fewer sails cut across it. Perhaps merchants have grown cautious. Perhaps foreign fleets make travel dangerous. Perhaps internal unrest in one region disrupts outbound shipments. In an interconnected network, failure spreads. If Cyprus exports less copper, Mycenaean bronze production slows. If Mycenaean trade weakens, Levantine ports lose customers. If Levantine cities decline, Egyptian imports shrink. Each node affects another. The web tightens. And when tension becomes too great, it snaps. You walk along a once busy dock at sunset. A single ship finally approaches. Its cargo is smaller than expected. Relief washes over waiting merchants. But relief is muted, because one reduced shipment does not restore confidence. Confidence rebuilds slowly, but erodes quickly. And once merchants begin choosing safety over risk, trade contracts further. It is not dramatic. There are no flaming arrows, no crashing gates, just hesitation, then contraction, then scarcity, then vulnerability. The Bronze Age world depended on distance, on ships crossing open water, on caravans crossing deserts, on trust crossing borders. When movement slows, systems stiffen. When systems stiffen, they crack under stress. In the next section, you will lift your eyes from warehouses and docks. You will look upward, toward the sky, because sometimes collapse begins not in ports, but in fields waiting for rain. You step away from the harbor, away from ledgers and warehouses, away from ships that may or may not arrive. Now you stand in an open field. The soil beneath your feet is cracked, not dramatically, not catastrophically, just slightly drier than it should be. The late Bronze Age world depended on agriculture as much as it depended on trade. Palaces could redistribute resources. Armies could defend borders. Diplomats could maintain alliances. But none of it mattered if harvests failed. You look up at the sky. It is bright, clear, almost beautiful, and that may be part of the problem. One well-known historical fact gives weight to this possibility. Paleoclimate studies, including pollen samples and sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean, suggest a period of prolonged drought around the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. Not a single failed season, but extended aridity, reduced rainfall, lower river levels, crop stress. Historians still debate how severe and widespread this drought was. Some scholars argue it played a central role in destabilizing already fragile systems. Others caution that climate stress alone cannot explain simultaneous collapse across multiple regions. But climate does not need to act alone. It only needs to apply pressure. You walk through a field of barley. The stalks are thinner than usual. Farmers kneel quietly, inspecting the crop. They do not panic, because farmers are used to variability. One dry year can be endured. Two can be managed. But several consecutive seasons of reduced yield begin to change things. Grain is the foundation of Bronze Age economies. Grain feeds workers. Grain feeds soldiers. Grain fills palace storage jars. Grain stabilizes cities. If harvests shrink, palaces redistribute less. If redistribution weakens, loyalty weakens. You imagine a local governor reporting to a central authority. The harvest is lower this year. Taxes will be reduced. Rations may need adjustment. The king does not see this as collapse. He sees it as inconvenience. But inconvenience accumulates. In Egypt, the Nile's predictable flooding usually ensured stability. But even the Nile could fluctuate. Records from later Egyptian periods show awareness of famine during low inundation years. While direct evidence for Nile failure in 1177 BC remains debated, regional climate shifts could have affected multiple agricultural zones simultaneously. You move north to Anatolia. Triggering data from some regions suggests periods of environmental stress around this era. Again, historians debate the precision of dating, but the possibility lingers. Reduced rainfall in upland areas, less grain reaching cities, livestock weakened, migration increasing. There's an eccentric curiosity preserved in ancient texts from other eras that feels relevant here. In times of drought, some communities turned to ritual appeals to weather gods. Offerings increased. Ceremonies intensified. If rain did not come, interpretations varied. Divine displeasure, moral failing, political weakness. Climate stress is not only material, it is psychological. You stand in a small village outside a major city. The villagers still farm, still plant, still harvest, but their surplus is smaller. When palace collectors arrive, tension is subtle but real. If farmers surrender too much grain, their families suffer. If they surrender too little, punishment follows. Climate stress amplifies existing social strain. Historians still argue whether drought triggered migration waves. If harvests failed in one region, populations might move in search of better conditions. Those movements could destabilize neighboring territories. Perhaps some of the groups labeled as sea peoples were not purely invaders. Perhaps some were displaced agricultural communities searching for survival. Climate does not respect borders, and in a tightly connected world, pressure in one region spreads outward. You kneel and pick up a handful of dry soil. It crumbles easily. Agriculture in the Bronze Age relied heavily on predictable seasonal patterns. Irrigation existed in some areas, but large-scale resilience to prolonged drought was limited. Granaries could buffer short-term shortages, but extended aridity depleted reserves. And when reserves shrink, trust shrinks, because centralized systems promise stability. If they cannot deliver it, legitimacy weakens. You imagine a palace facing simultaneous pressures. Trade reduced, harvests lower, foreign tensions rising, administrators recalculating constantly. The margin for error narrows. One poor harvest might have been manageable in isolation, but combined with trade disruption and political instability, it becomes dangerous. There is something deeply unsettling about environmental stress. It does not announce itself with banners. It does not march with armies. It simply persists, quietly, year after year. You look again at the sky. It remains beautiful, blue, open, silent, and beneath it fields struggle. In some areas, evidence suggests settlement abandonment coincided with environmental strain. Smaller communities relocated. Larger urban centers shrank. The landscape itself began to reorganize. Historians still debate whether climate change was the primary driver of collapse or merely one contributing factor among many. But few deny that environmental stress likely intensified vulnerabilities. You stand between field and city, between soil and stone. You see how dependent even the greatest empires were on rain, on seasonal rhythm, on ecological balance. Remove stability from a land, and human systems wobble. The Bronze Age world was complex, sophisticated, interconnected, but it was not immune to climate. And when climate shifts combine with economic fragility and political tension, the result can feel inevitable. You walk slowly back toward the city walls. Farmers carry smaller bundles of grain. Palace collectors speak in measured tones. No one yet calls it collapse, but strain is everywhere. In the next section, you will feel something even less predictable than drought, something that strikes without warning. The ground itself shifting. You feel it before you understand it. Not in the sky, not in the sea, but beneath your feet. The late Bronze Age world was built on stone. Massive fortification walls, temple platforms, palatial complexes, granaries stacked high, administrative centers built to project permanence. Stone gives the illusion of stability. But stone is not immune to movement. You are standing in Anatolia. The air is calm. The hills roll gently outward. Nothing suggests danger. Then the ground trembles. Not violently. At first, just enough to unsettle balance. A cup rattles on a wooden table. Dust drifts from a ceiling beam. Animals shift uneasily in their pens. Then comes the second tremor. Stronger. Walls crack. Masonry shifts. Storage jars topple and shatter. You step outside as citizens gather in confusion. There are no warning signs for earthquakes. No diplomatic letters. No visible fleets on the horizon. Only sudden movement. One well-known historical fact supports the possibility of seismic instability during this era. Parts of the eastern Mediterranean sit along active tectonic fault lines, including the Anatolian Fault and regions of the Levant. Archaeologists have identified destruction layers in some Bronze Age cities that may be consistent with earthquake damage. Collapsed walls without burn marks. Foundations shifted without evidence of invasion. Historians still debate how many of these destruction layers were caused by earthquakes rather than human conflict. But seismic activity was certainly present in the region. You walk through a fortified city. Its outer walls once seemed invincible. Cyclopean blocks fitted tightly together. But stone resists force differently than wood. Under sustained shaking, even massive walls can fracture. Imagine a city already under economic strain. Trade reduced. Harvests uncertain. Then infrastructure weakens. Walls require repair. Roads crack. Water systems become unreliable. Earthquakes do not conquer cities directly, but they destabilize them. You stand inside a Mycenaean palace. Columns sway slightly. A decorative fresco flakes from plaster. Storage jars topple, spilling grain across stone floors. Grain that cannot be recovered easily. In centralized systems, infrastructure matters. Administrative centers rely on structural integrity. If earthquake damage disrupts governance, even temporarily, coordination falters. And when coordination falters in a fragile system, instability spreads. There is an eccentric curiosity in the archaeological interpretation of some late Bronze Age sites. Certain destruction layers show walls collapsed outward rather than inward. This can sometimes indicate seismic activity rather than assault. Historians debate individual cases intensely. Was this city burned by attackers? Or did an earthquake weaken defenses, making later invasion easier? The evidence rarely speaks clearly. But imagine multiple tremors across a region within decades. Not one catastrophic event, but repeated shaking. Each quake damaging different settlements. Each requiring labor and resources to repair. Resources already strained. You step into a coastal settlement. A tremor shifts harbor infrastructure. Stone docks crack. Ships cannot anchor safely. Trade slows further. Now environmental stress combines with economic fragility. In some areas, the concept of an earthquake storm has been proposed, clusters of seismic events occurring over a period of years along connected fault systems. Historians still argue about the scale and timing of such events in the late Bronze Age. But even moderate seismic activity can compound vulnerability. You imagine a king attempting to maintain authority amid repeated shocks. One year, Harvest is weak. Another year, trade falters. Then a tremor damages palace walls. Rebuilding requires labor. Labor requires food. Food is limited. Confidence erodes. Confidence is the quiet foundation of centralized power. If citizens begin to perceive weakness, loyalty shifts. You walk through a partially collapsed gate. Stone blocks lie at awkward angles. No burn marks. No arrowheads embedded in wood. Just gravity having done its work. An earthquake does not announce political intention, but its consequences can be political. If neighboring rivals see damaged fortifications, they may sense opportunity. If migration pressures increase simultaneously, weakened cities become targets. Natural disaster does not act alone. It interacts. It accelerates. It magnifies other pressures. You feel another tremor. Short, sharp, then silence. Citizens gather outside buildings, hesitant to return indoors. Trade pauses. Administrative meetings postponed. Ritual offerings made. Appeals to earth deities. Ancient societies understood seismic events through spiritual frameworks. Appeasement rituals may have increased. Interpretations varied. Divine warning. Cosmic imbalance. Moral failing. Fear does not require perfect understanding. It requires unpredictability. Historians still debate whether earthquakes were a primary driver of collapse or simply one stress among many. But when combined with drought, trade disruption, and migration, seismic instability could tip systems already near their limit. You walk beyond the city, across cracked roadways, toward open fields, stone and soil both unsettled. The late Bronze Age world was interconnected, but was also geographically vulnerable. When the ground moves, even empires feel small. You pause and listen. The earth is quiet again, but cracks remain. Foundations weakened, confidence shaken, and in a fragile system, weakness spreads faster than stability. In the next section, you will step inside palace walls again, not to see trade, not to feel tremors, but to observe something even more destabilizing. Hunger. You step back inside the palace. Outside, the fields struggle. The ground trembles from time to time. Ships arrive less often. But here, within stone walls, authority still performs stability. Servants move quietly through corridors. Officials carry tablets. Guards stand at gates. From a distance, nothing appears broken. And yet, hunger is patient. It does not storm the gates. It waits. One well-known historical anchor gives this moment weight. In later Egyptian records, including inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, there are references to grain shortages and even the first recorded labor strike in history, when workers at Deir el-Medina protested delayed rations. Although this event occurred slightly later than 1177 BC, it reveals something important about the fragility of centralized supply systems. When grain stops flowing, even monumental civilizations feel strain. You stand in a palace storage hall. Rows of clay jars line the walls. Some are full, some are not. An administrator counts, recounts, adjusts allocations. He does not call it famine. He calls it redistribution. But redistribution without replenishment becomes depletion. In centralized Bronze Age systems, palaces collected agricultural surplus from surrounding territories. In return, they provided protection, organization, and stability. It was an exchange. But if harvests shrink and trade slows simultaneously, the palace has less to redistribute. Less grain for soldiers, less oil for craftsmen, less rations for laborers. You imagine whispers beginning among workers. Rations slightly smaller. Delivery slightly delayed. One missed payment. Two, still manageable. But hunger amplifies perception. Even minor shortages feel personal. There is an eccentric curiosity preserved in some ancient administrative records from various regions. Meticulous ration lists detailing exact portions of grain allocated to workers, scribes, and craftsmen. The precision is striking. Half measures recorded carefully. Small discrepancies noted. In stable times, This precision demonstrates order. In unstable times, it reveals anxiety. Because when food is abundant, measurement is routine. When food is scarce, measurement becomes survival. You walk into a kitchen courtyard. Servants stir large pots, but the portions seem thinner. Guards receive priority. Elites remain supplied. But laborers at the edge of the system feel the tightening first. Historians still debate whether internal revolt played a major role in the late Bronze Age collapse. Some scholars suggest that economic strain may have triggered uprisings within weakened states. Others argue that evidence for widespread rebellion is limited and regionally specific. But imagine a palace already under pressure. Trade reduced. Infrastructure damaged. Harvest smaller. Now imagine unrest among workers tasked with maintaining walls, roads, and storage systems. Confidence erodes quietly. Authority depends not only on force, but on provision. If a ruler cannot provide food, legitimacy weakens. You walk into an administrative chamber. A governor listens to complaints from rural representatives. They speak respectfully, but their tone carries strain. They cannot meet tribute quotas. Their fields yielded less. They ask for leniency. The governor calculates risk. Reduce tribute and weaken central stores. Enforce tribute and risk rebellion. Neither choice restores abundance. In some regions, archaeological evidence suggests population decline in urban centers following destruction layers. Whether due to famine, migration, or conflict, cities shrink. Urban contraction can indicate stress, because cities rely heavily on food inflow from surrounding countryside. If that flow falters, urban life becomes unsustainable. You imagine a soldier stationed at a border fortress. His ration is smaller than last year. He notices. He says nothing, but morale shifts. A centralized state depends on reliable loyalty, and loyalty is strengthened by stability. When food becomes uncertain, fear grows. Not dramatic fear, just quiet calculation. You stand in the palace garden, once lush, now slightly less vibrant. Water use may be rationed. Luxury becomes less defensible in times of scarcity. There is something deeply destabilizing about hunger inside walls meant to project power, because palaces symbolize control. If hunger enters them, symbolism cracks. Historians still argue about the degree to which famine directly contributed to the collapse of specific Bronze Age states. Direct evidence is often fragmentary, but combined with drought indicators and trade decline, the possibility becomes compelling. You imagine internal tension rising just as external pressures mount. If sea peoples appear on the coast while grain stores are low, if earthquakes damage infrastructure while workers demand full rations, if trade slows while tribute expectations remain high, the system faces pressure from every direction, and pressure seeks release. You pause in a quiet corridor. A scribe adjusts numbers on a tablet. He cannot conjure grain from absence. He can only record reduction. The palace still stands. Walls remain. Ceremonies continue. But beneath ritual, there is unease. Hunger rarely begins with famine. It begins with slight shortage, then rationing, then resentment, then movement. Because if a city cannot feed its people, people leave. Migration accelerates. Rural areas may absorb some. Other regions feel the influx, and instability spreads. The late Bronze Age world was interconnected economically, but it was also interconnected demographically. Population shifts could destabilize already fragile neighbors. You walk toward the palace gate. Beyond it, the countryside stretches outward. Farmers still work. Soldiers still guard. Administrators still calculate. But the margin has narrowed. And when margins disappear, collapse is not an explosion. It is surrender to arithmetic. In the next section, you will step back and watch the pattern unfold across the entire region. Not one city, not one kingdom, but a domino effect spreading across an interconnected world. You step even farther back now, far enough that individual cities blur into patterns. far enough that smoke rising from one settlement no longer feels isolated. From this height, you begin to see what the people of 1177 BC could not. You see connection, and then you see collapse moving through connection. The late Bronze Age world was not a collection of separate kingdoms quietly minding their own affairs. It was a network, a living, breathing system of exchange, diplomacy, obligation, and dependency. Egypt traded with the Levant. The Levant traded with Anatolia. Anatolia traded with Mycenaean Greece. Mycenaean elites exchanged prestige goods across the sea. Tin moved across astonishing distances. Copper crossed water in heavy ingots shaped like ox hides. Grain stabilized cities far from where it was grown. Everything touched something else. One well-known historical reality grounds this pattern. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BC, multiple major political centers across the eastern Mediterranean experienced destruction, abandonment, or severe decline within a relatively compressed time frame. The Hittite Empire disappears as a dominant power. Mycenaean palace centers fall. Ugarit is destroyed. Many Canaanite cities burn. Egypt survives but contracts in influence. The clustering is remarkable. Historians still debate the exact synchronization of these events. Archaeological dating carries margins of uncertainty. Radiocarbon ranges overlap. Ceramic typologies shift gradually. But even with scholarly caution, the broader pattern remains undeniable. Multiple pillars of a shared system weaken within decades of each other. You imagine the first major pillar falling. Perhaps the Hittite administrative core fractures under combined pressure, trade disruption, migration, environmental strain, internal tension. As Hittite authority weakens, trade corridors through Anatolia become less secure. Merchants hesitate. Caravans reroute or halt. Neighboring states lose predictable access to materials. Then you shift west. Mycenaean palaces, already tightly centralized, depend heavily on controlled redistribution and external supply networks. If imports falter and coastal security weakens, palace economies begin to wobble. Linear B tablets record careful inventories, but careful records cannot create new shipments. When palaces burn, administrative literacy disappears with them, not because people forget language overnight, but because centralized bureaucracy dissolves. You move south to the Levant. Cities like Ugarit rely on maritime trade and inland exchange. If northern partners collapse and sea lanes become unstable, Levantine hubs face isolation. A single destroyed port disrupts multiple dependent settlements. Then Egypt faces waves of pressure. Though it repels direct invasions, it must allocate resources to defense. Defense is expensive. Defense pulls grain, labor, and metal away from civil stability. Even survival carries cost. The domino effect does not require perfect timing. It requires dependency. If one region weakens, its partners feel strain. If multiple weaken, strain compounds. You imagine a merchant in Cyprus hearing that Anatolian routes are unsafe. He delays departure. That delay means Mycenaean workshops receive less copper. Reduced production means fewer exports. Reduced exports mean fewer reciprocal goods. Trust contracts. Confidence thins. There is an eccentric curiosity in post-collapse material culture that speaks softly to transformation. After the fall of palace systems, many regions show simpler, more locally produced pottery styles replacing elaborate, standardized forms. This is not intellectual decline. It is decentralization. When large networks dissolve, communities rely on what they can produce directly. The world becomes smaller, more local, less interconnected. Historians still argue whether the late Bronze Age collapse should be described as catastrophe or transition. Some emphasize burning cities and abandoned capitals. Others highlight resilience in rural continuity and emerging cultures. But even those who stress continuity acknowledge that the international palatial system, this complex web of elite diplomacy and large-scale redistribution, did not recover in the same form. You step even higher, as if viewing a map. Dots represent cities. Lines represent trade routes. Some dots fade. Some lines vanish. The remaining dots grow isolated. Isolation changes behavior. Alliances that once felt secure become uncertain. Marriages that once sealed peace lose strategic value. Military coordination falters. The web unravels. And once unraveling begins, it accelerates. Because interconnected systems amplify both growth and decline. You consider whether any single factor would have toppled the entire Bronze Age world alone. Probably not. Drought alone might have strained agriculture, but allowed adaptation. Earthquakes alone might have damaged infrastructure, but permitted rebuilding. Migration alone might have been absorbed. Trade disruption alone might have rerouted. But together, these pressures intersect. Climate reduces harvests. Reduced harvests weaken economies. Weakened economies reduce military strength. Reduced military strength invites aggression or migration. Aggression disrupts trade further. Trade disruption deepens scarcity. Scarcity fuels internal unrest. Internal unrest weakens governance. Governance falters. Another pillar falls. The domino effect is not theatrical. It is cumulative. You imagine standing in a palace courtyard years after initial strain. The architecture remains, but fewer emissaries arrive. Fewer tribute caravans enter the gates. The king still sits on his throne, but his reach is shorter. His voice carries less distance. A system that once spanned seas now struggles to stabilize a single province. Historians still debate whether the Bronze Age collapse unfolded rapidly within a generation or extended gradually over several decades. The archaeological record suggests variation by region, but variation does not erase pattern. Enough nodes weakened close enough in time to fracture the whole. You pause, because this is the heart of it. The late Bronze Age was powerful precisely because it was connected. But connection is double-edged. Interdependence spreads prosperity. It also spreads vulnerability. Remove enough support points, and the structure no longer distributes weight evenly. It collapses inward. In the next section, you will observe something even more subtle than falling cities. You will notice not stone, not flame, not hunger, but silence. Because when centralized systems collapse, writing sometimes fades with them. And when writing fades, memory changes. You begin to notice something quieter than fire, quieter than hunger, quieter even than political collapse. You notice absence, not of people, not of buildings, but of writing. You stand inside a Mycenaean palace archive room. Clay tablets line shelves. Each tablet carries records of livestock, grain allocations, bronze inventories, labor assignments. Linear B script flows across the clay in small, careful impressions. It is administrative, practical, unemotional, and deeply powerful, because writing in the late Bronze Age is not casual, is not widespread literacy, is centralized control. One well-known historical fact anchors this transformation. After the destruction of Mycenaean palace centers around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, Linear B writing disappears from Greece for several centuries. Not gradually, abruptly. There are no surviving administrative records from the immediate post-palatial period. The script vanishes. You imagine the final moments before that silence. A scribe inscribes inventory numbers. He records livestock. He lists rations. He assumes tomorrow will require more records. Then the palace burns, or is abandoned, or loses administrative function, and the scribal school dissolves. Writing in this world is not universal. It is institutional. When institutions collapse, literacy collapses with them. Historians still debate whether writing disappeared because populations declined, because trade networks fragmented, or because decentralized communities no longer required complex bureaucratic record-keeping. But the result is unmistakable. Administrative silence. You walk into a Levantine city. Earlier, tablets recorded diplomatic correspondence and commercial exchange. After destruction layers, fewer records appear. In some places, literacy persists in limited form. In others, it fades. The web of written diplomacy that once connected great kings dissolves. You consider what writing meant in the late Bronze Age. It was not poetry carved into marble. It was logistics, taxation, storage, diplomatic negotiation. Writing was the skeleton of large-scale coordination. Without it, long-distance administration becomes difficult. Not impossible, but less precise. There is an eccentric curiosity in the archaeological record. Some linear B tablets survived only because palace fires baked the clay, preserving them unintentionally. Without destruction, they might have dissolved. So the very catastrophe that ended the system preserved its last words. That irony lingers. You kneel beside a broken archive shelf. Clay fragments scattered. Some texts incomplete. Some names forever truncated. The loss of writing does not mean the loss of language. People still speak, still remember, still tell stories. But administrative memory weakens. And when memory weakens, coordination shrinks. Historians still argue about the extent of literacy even before collapse. It may have been limited to elite scribes, but that elite literacy allowed complex economic systems to function. When palaces fall, scribal training ceases. Without centralized storage, record-keeping loses purpose. Villages may not need detailed tax inventories. Local exchange requires less documentation. The world becomes smaller. You imagine a generation growing up after palace collapse. They hear stories of former grandeur. Massive halls, foreign envoys, ships from distant lands. But they do not learn linear B, because there is no palace demanding it. Knowledge shifts from administrative to oral. Oral traditions preserve identity, but they change over time. And so the world transitions quietly. You step into what was once a bustling archive center. Now it is silent. Dust settles where scribes once worked. No new tablets dry in the sun. No diplomatic messages await dispatch. The silence feels heavier than rubble, because writing connects distant places through shared understanding. Without it, regions become more insular. Historians still debate whether the so-called Greek Dark Age that followed should truly be called dark. There is evidence of continuity in material culture and gradual adaptation. But what is clear is that monumental architecture decreases. Long-distance trade contracts, and writing disappears from much of the Greek world until the adoption of the alphabet centuries later. You consider Egypt. Unlike Mycenaean Greece, Egypt retains its writing system. Hieroglyphs persist. Administrative continuity survives. And yet, even Egypt experiences contraction in influence and territorial control. So writing alone does not guarantee resilience. But its disappearance marks systemic transformation. You walk beyond the ruins of a palace into a smaller settlement. People still farm, still build, still trade locally, but they do not record transactions in centralized archives. They rely on trust, on memory, on face-to-face exchange. The scale has changed. Not humanity, not intelligence, but scale. The late Bronze Age world once coordinated across seas. After collapse, coordination becomes regional, then local, then personal. You imagine how many diplomatic letters were once exchanged annually between kings. Now imagine that channel closing. No more "my brother" greetings carved into clay. No more gift lists cataloged meticulously. The web of written diplomacy dissolves. And without written agreements, alliances become harder to sustain across distance. Silence spreads not only through ruined cities, but through archives, through administrative chambers, through scribal schools. And silence reshapes civilization. In the next section, you will step into the lives of those who survived. Not kings, not palace administrators, but small communities adapting to a quieter world. Because collapse does not erase humanity. It transforms how humanity organizes itself. You leave the palace behind. Leave the archive. Leave the great halls of centralized power. Now you walk along a narrow dirt path between low stone houses. Smoke rises gently from simple hearths. Goats move lazily between rough fences. Children carry small bundles of wood. This world is quieter, smaller, but is not empty. The collapse of the late Bronze Age did not erase humanity. It reshaped scale. You are now in what later historians would call a post-palatial world. In Greece, after the fall of Mycenaean centers, large administrative complexes vanish. Monumental construction declines. Writing disappears for centuries. But people remain. Villages continue. Fields are planted. Animals are herded. One well-known historical fact anchors this transition. Archaeological evidence from the early Iron Age in Greece shows continued occupation at many smaller sites, even as major palace centers were abandoned. Population shifts. It does not vanish entirely. Historians still debate whether this period should truly be described as a dark age. Some argue that the term exaggerates decline and ignores cultural continuity. Others note clear reductions in long-distance trade, monumental architecture, and literacy. Both perspectives contain truth. From your vantage point, the difference is scale. You walk into a modest village. There is no centralized archive, no diplomatic hall, no international envoy arriving by sea. But there is stability of a different kind. Local exchange replaces distant trade. Barter replaces bureaucratic redistribution. Communities rely more on direct relationships than administrative systems. There's an eccentric curiosity in early Iron Age material culture. Pottery becomes simpler in style and production. Large-scale, standardized luxury goods decline. Instead, locally made ceramics dominate. This is not artistic failure. It is economic adaptation. When long-distance exchange shrinks, local production fills the gap. You watch a blacksmith working with iron. Iron was known in the late Bronze Age, but rare and often symbolic. Now, gradually, iron tools become more common. Historians still debate whether iron adoption was accelerated by bronze scarcity after trade disruption. Is possible. Iron ore is more widely available than tin. Though harder to smelt, it reduces dependency on distant supply chains. If bronze networks collapse, iron offers independence. You observe a farmer repairing a simple plow. It is not ornate. It is functional. In a smaller-scale world, resilience shifts. Large palaces require surplus and coordination. Small villages require cooperation and adaptability. You move toward a hilltop settlement. Unlike earlier palatial centers, this one is modest. Defensive walls exist, but they are practical rather than monumental. Population density is lower. Food production is local. Trade exists, but regionally. Isolation brings vulnerability, but it also brings autonomy. Historians still argue about population decline during this period. Some evidence suggests contraction. Other data indicates regional continuity. Migration likely redistributed people rather than eliminating them. Communities reorganized. New social structures emerged. Leadership became more localized. You sit beside a fire as elders recount stories. Without centralized archives, memory shifts into oral tradition. Genealogies preserved in spoken form. Myths carried through repetition. Centuries later, epic poetry will emerge in Greece. Stories of heroic ages and distant wars. Perhaps some fragments of Bronze Age memory survive in those tales. But memory transforms when not fixed in clay. You imagine a generation born after palace collapse. They have never seen linear B tablets, never watched foreign envoys exchange prestige gifts, never known a world coordinated across seas. For them, normality is smaller, local, manageable, the horizon of expectation contracts. There is quiet strength in that. Large systems amplify power and vulnerability. Small systems reduce both. You walk through fields cultivated carefully. Yield may be modest, but risk is distributed. If one region fails, its collapse does not necessarily trigger a continental chain reaction. Interdependence decreases. So does fragility. Historians still debate whether this post-collapse world was more violent or more stable at local levels. Archaeological evidence suggests both conflict and adaptation. Fortified hill settlements appear, but so do signs of sustained habitation. You stand at sunset overlooking a cluster of small homes. No grand palace dominates the skyline. No massive archive stores distant treaties. But smoke rises steadily from hearths. Crops grow. Children laugh. Civilization has not ended. It has transformed. The late Bronze Age system collapsed. But human societies recalibrated. They reduced scale. Simplified networks. Shifted technologies. Iron slowly replaces bronze. Local identities strengthen. International diplomacy fades. You feel the quiet dignity of survival. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just persistent. In the next section, you will return briefly to the present through the lens of historians. Because even today, scholars continue to debate what truly caused the collapse. Was it invasion, climate, economic fragility, complexity itself, or all of them together? You return now, gently, from the fields and villages, not to the Bronze Age itself, but to the present. Because even today, scholars sit in quiet offices and dusty excavation sites asking the same question. What truly caused the collapse? You stand in a modern archive room. Maps of the Eastern Mediterranean spread across tables. Charts of rainfall patterns pinned to walls. Radiocarbon dates scribbled beside excavation layers. The mystery of 1177 BC remains unsolved. One well-known historical fact frames the debate clearly. Eric Klein's book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, popularized the idea that this period marked a dramatic systemic breakdown across the Eastern Mediterranean. His argument does not point to a single cause. Instead, it proposes a perfect storm of interrelated crises. But historians still argue about emphasis. Some scholars prioritize invasion. The Sea Peoples loom large in Egyptian inscriptions. Reliefs at Medinet Habu depict naval conflict and land battles. Were coordinated foreign assaults the primary driver, or were they opportunistic actors entering an already destabilized world? Others emphasize climate change, pollen samples, tree ring data, sediment cores from the Eastern Mediterranean. Evidence suggests periods of prolonged drought. Was environmental stress the root cause, undermining agricultural output and triggering migration? Or was drought only one pressure among many? Then there is the earthquake hypothesis. Clusters of seismic activity may have damaged infrastructure across multiple regions. Did repeated tremors weaken cities just enough to make them vulnerable? Or is the evidence too inconsistent to support large-scale seismic explanation? Economic fragility also dominates scholarly discussion. The late Bronze Age was highly interconnected. Trade routes carried essential materials like tin and copper. If those routes faltered, bronze production declined. If bronze production declined, military strength weakened. If military strength weakened, borders became unstable. Historians still debate whether economic interdependence created systemic vulnerability. Was complexity itself the problem? The concept of systems collapse suggests that highly complex societies require constant resource input. When resource input declines, complexity becomes unsustainable. Administrative layers become costly. Military maintenance drains reserves. Elite lifestyles demand imports. When multiple stressors converge, the system exceeds its adaptive capacity. You sit at a table with scattered academic articles. Each presents evidence. Each emphasizes a different variable. None alone fully satisfies. There's an eccentric curiosity in the historiography itself. Earlier generations of scholars sometimes favored single-cause explanations. Invasion, or drought, or internal revolt. Modern research increasingly leans toward multi-causal models. Perhaps this reflects our own era's understanding of complexity. We are more comfortable acknowledging that large systems rarely fail for only one reason. You imagine presenting the collapse as a mathematical equation. Invasion plus drought plus trade disruption plus earthquakes plus political fragility. But history resists clean arithmetic because each region experienced unique combinations of stress. The Hittite Empire may have faced different pressures than Mycenaean Greece. Egypt's survival complicates any universal explanation. Some areas collapsed completely. Others transformed. Others endured. Historians still debate chronology intensely. Did the Hittite collapse precede Mycenaean destruction, or overlap precisely? Were Sea Peoples a cause or consequence? Did migration originate from climate-affected zones? Dating layers precisely remains difficult. Radiocarbon dating carries ranges. Ceramic sequences overlap. Textual records are fragmentary. Uncertainty persists, and that uncertainty is part of the fascination. You step back from a table of maps. There is something humbling about this. Despite satellite imagery, advanced laboratory analysis, and decades of excavation, scholars still cannot pinpoint a single definitive cause. Perhaps that is because collapse is rarely linear. You consider how modern systems function: global trade, interconnected economies, climate variability, political tension, migration flows, seismic zones. The parallels feel uncomfortable. But tonight, you do not draw conclusions. You simply observe the debate. Some historians argue that focusing too heavily on catastrophe overshadows continuity. They emphasize resilience, adaptation, cultural survival. Others stress the scale of urban abandonment and systemic contraction. They describe it as one of the most significant collapses in ancient history. Both perspectives hold pieces of truth. The Bronze Age world did not vanish entirely, but its international order dissolved, its palatial networks fractured, its diplomatic web unraveled. You imagine future historians studying our era, piecing together fragments, debating emphasis. Was it climate? Was it economics? Was it politics? Was it complexity? History rarely offers clean answers. It offers patterns and interpretation. You walk away from the modern archive room. The debate remains active, and perhaps that is fitting, because the collapse of 1177 BC was not a single event. It was a convergence, a cascade, a shift from one mode of civilization to another. In the final section, you will return to stillness, to reflect quietly on fragility, on resilience, and on the long silence that followed the fall of a connected world. You stand at the edge of the ancient world, not at a battlefield, not inside a palace, not beside a burning city, but at the shoreline. The sea is calm. It does not remember fleets. It does not remember trade routes. It does not remember kings calling each other brother. Waves move in steady rhythm, as they always have. You think about how vast the late Bronze Age once felt. Great palaces coordinating distant lands. Ships crossing open water with copper and tin. Clay tablets carrying diplomacy across deserts and coastlines. Fields feeding cities. Cities feeding armies. Armies protecting trade. Trade sustaining empires. It seemed permanent. It seemed sophisticated. It seemed unbreakable. And yet, within a few generations, the system unraveled. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic moment, but through accumulation, through convergence, through stress meeting fragility. You walk slowly along the sand. You imagine the last Mycenaean scribe pressing marks in a clay, the last Hittite administrator calculating tribute, the last Levantine merchant waiting for a shipment that would not come. They did not know they were living at the end of something. They thought they were navigating difficulty, adjusting, Responding, because collapse rarely announces itself as final. It feels like a series of temporary crises, until they're not temporary. One well-known historical truth offers quiet perspective. Civilization did not end in 1177 BC. It transformed. The Bronze Age world gave way to the Iron Age. New technologies emerged. New political structures formed. New cultural expressions developed. What collapsed was a system of interconnection. What survived was humanity. Historians still debate which factor mattered most. Climate, migration, economic complexity, seismic instability, internal revolt, or all of them together. But perhaps the deeper lesson is not about which domino fell first. Perhaps it is about how interconnected systems amplify both strength and vulnerability. You sit on a low stone overlooking the water. The horizon stretches outward. It looks infinite, and you realize something comforting. Every civilization believes itself stable. Every era feels permanent to those living within it. And yet history shows us cycles. Expansion, integration, strain, adaptation, transformation. The late Bronze Age collapse was not the first societal shift, nor the last. It was a reminder that complexity carries risk, that networks require balance, that resilience depends on flexibility. You breathe slowly. The air is cooler now. Dusk approaches. Small settlements continue inland. Villages adapt quietly. Iron replaces bronze. Local leaders replace distant kings. Stories replace tablets. The world shrinks in scale, but continues in spirit. There is something strangely peaceful about that, because collapse did not erase language. It did not erase agriculture. It did not erase community. It erased a particular structure, and structures, however grand, are temporary. You imagine centuries passing. New empires rise. New scripts appear. The Greek alphabet emerges. Assyria regains strength. Persia will come. Rome will come. Civilizations will rise and fall again and again. The shoreline remains. The sea remains. The sky remains. You let the weight of that settle gently. The people of 1177 BC did not see themselves as the end of an era. They were simply living, working, adapting, surviving, as you are, as we all are. History is not a straight line. It is a tide. And tonight, you have watched one tide recede. You have walked through palaces and villages, through drought and tremor, through trade routes and empty archives. You have seen a world interconnected and then fragmented. And you have seen that even fragmentation carries seeds of renewal. Now the sky darkens softly. The water reflects fading light. There is no urgency here, no alarm, only stillness. You do not need to solve the mystery completely. Historians will continue debating. New discoveries will refine timelines. New data will adjust theories. But uncertainty is part of the story. The Bronze Age collapse remains compelling precisely because it resists simplicity. You let your thoughts slow. Civilizations are fragile, but humanity is persistent. Systems collapse, but life reorganizes. Complexity contracts, then expands again. You feel a sense of quiet continuity stretching from that ancient shoreline to your own present moment. Thousands of years separate you from 1177 BC, and yet the patterns feel familiar. Interconnection, fragility, adaptation, transformation. The waves move steadily, back and forth, back and forth. No beginning, no end, only rhythm. And as you rest in that rhythm, you allow the ancient world to fade gently into night. No more fire, no more debate, no more strain, only quiet, only sea, only the slow drift of history into sleep. Sweet dreams.